Family Guy is the fourth most streamed television show across all digital platforms in the first half of 2025. Let that sit for a second. Fourth out of every show ever made, it has been one of the top streamed shows on Hulu for years. It is in syndication on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, TBS, FXX, and Freeform. It pulled 22 million viewers for its very first episode. And it is one of only a handful of shows in television history that literally came back from the dead because fans loved it so much. And yet, if you go on the internet right now, if you type Family Guy into any Reddit thread, any YouTube comment section, any Twitter discourse, you will find something really strange. People hate this show. Not in the casual, it's not really my thing kind of way. In the visceral, this show is an insult to comedy, and everyone who watches it is an idiot kind of way. There are entire video essays dedicated to explaining why Family Guy is terrible. There are fan wikis cataloguing every single bad decision the writers have ever made. There are former fans who talk about this show the way people talk about an ex who wronged them. So how did we get here? How did a show that was once so beloved that fans literally bought enough DVDs to force a network to bring it back become one of the most mocked and criticised animated series in existence? That is what this video is about. So sit back, get comfortable, maybe close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through the entire story of how Family Guy went from a cultural phenomenon to one of the most hated shows on television. We are going to cover everything. The golden age, the cancellation, the miraculous comeback, the slow decline, the culture wars, the feuds, and the bizarre paradox of a show that everyone claims to despise but millions of people still watch every single day. Let's start at the beginning. Seth MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. He showed an aptitude for cartooning at a young age, and when it came time for college, he enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design to study animation. That decision would eventually change the landscape of American television, but nobody knew that yet. He was just a kid who liked drawing cartoons. While he was still a student at RISD, MacFarlane created an animated short film called The Life of Larry. It was a rough little project about a dopey middle-aged guy and his sarcastic talking dog. If that sounds familiar, it should. That short film was the prototype for what would eventually become Family Guy. Executives at Hanna-Barbera saw the short and were impressed enough to offer MacFarlane a job after graduation. So in the mid-90s, he moved out to Hollywood and started working as an animator and writer on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. All of those were Hanna-Barbera productions, and all of them gave MacFarlane valuable experience in the world of professional animation. But MacFarlane had bigger ambitions. He created a follow-up short to The Life of Larry called Larry and Steve, and this one caught the attention of Fox. The network asked him to develop a full series based on the concept. MacFarlane was only 24 years old at the time. Think about that. A 24-year-old kid from Connecticut getting a series order from a major broadcast network. That almost never happens in animation, where development timelines stretch for years, and creators usually pay their dues for decades before getting their own show. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. That is one of the most coveted time slots in all of television. The premiere episode, Death Has a Shadow, pulled approximately 22 million viewers according to Nielsen ratings. That remains the highest single episode viewership figure in the entire history of the series. 22 million people watched the very first episode of Family Guy on the night it aired. The show was an instant sensation, and honestly, watching those early episodes now, you can understand why. Early Family Guy had something genuinely special about it. The cutaway gag format, which would later become the show's most criticised element, was actually fresh and exciting when it first appeared. Nobody was doing that on television. The Simpsons had been running for a decade at that point, and while it was brilliant, it followed a traditional sitcom structure. Family Guy took that structure and detonated it. The show would be telling a normal family story, and then suddenly Peter would say something like, "This is worse than that time I..." And the screen would cut to some completely unrelated joke. It felt anarchic. It felt like being inside the brain of someone with zero impulse control and an encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture. The characters worked too. Peter Griffin was a lovable idiot, and I mean that in the best possible way. He was dumb, sure, but in the early seasons he genuinely cared about his family. He would do stupid things, but at the end of the episode he would usually learn a lesson, or at least show that underneath all the buffoonery, he loved his wife and kids. Lois was the patient, long-suffering wife who occasionally got to show her own wild side. Chris was the sweet, dim-witted teenager who was basically a younger version of his dad. Meg was the awkward teenage daughter who just wanted to fit in and be accepted. Stewie was this insane evil genius baby who spent every episode plotting to kill his mother and take over the world. And Brian was the family dog, a dry, intellectual, slightly pretentious voice of reason who could talk and walk on two legs and drank martinis. That cast of characters, combined with the rapid-fire joke structure and MacFarlane's gift for voice acting, made Family Guy feel like nothing else on television. Season 1 averaged 14.12 million viewers and was ranked 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated show on a network that was still building its identity, those were incredible numbers. But then things started to go wrong almost immediately. Fox moved Family Guy from its Sunday night time slot, where it had been sandwiched between The Simpsons and The X-Files, to Thursday at 9 p.m. during Season 2. That scheduling change was devastating. Without The Simpsons lead-in, viewership dropped dramatically. Season 2 averaged just 6.74 million viewers. The show was pulled from the schedule, brought back briefly, pulled again, brought back again. It was this messy, unstable period where Fox clearly did not know what to do with the show. The Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog group, was not helping matters. The PTC had been targeting Family Guy since its premiere, and they launched a letter-writing campaign in May 2000 to convince Fox to cancel the series. They cited what they called the show's lewd sexual content as a corrupting influence on American culture. Over the course of the show's run, the PTC would name Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on at least 40 separate occasions. They put it on their list of worst primetime shows for family viewing in 2000, 2005 and 2006, and they named it the worst show of the entire 2006 to 2007 season. They also filed formal complaints with the Federal Communications Commission. While the PTC's influence on Fox's actual decision-making is debatable, the constant negative attention certainly did not help the show's case with nervous network executives. Season 3 averaged just 4.50 million viewers. On May 15th, 2002, when Fox unveiled its full lineup, Family Guy was nowhere to be found. The show was officially cancelled. 3 seasons, done. And honestly, that should have been the end of the story. Shows get cancelled all the time. 3 seasons is a decent run, and plenty of beloved shows have disappeared with less. But Family Guy's fans were not ready to let go. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in television history. Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, started airing reruns of Family Guy on April 20th, 2003. And the ratings were phenomenal. People who had missed the show during its original run were discovering it for the first time. People who had loved it were watching it again. The show became one of Adult Swim's most popular programs practically overnight. At the exact same time, Fox released the DVD box sets of seasons 1 and 2, and those DVDs did not just sell well, they sold astronomically well. Within 1 month of release, the first and second season box sets sold approximately 400,000 copies. By the time the dust settled, they had moved 2.2 million copies overall, making it the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second highest selling television DVD ever at that time, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. The third season DVD release sold more than 1 million copies on its own. Let me put that in perspective. This was a cancelled show, a show that Fox had determined was not worth keeping on the air, and it was outselling almost every other television DVD on the market. That had never happened before. Shows came back from cancellation before, sure, but not because of DVD sales. This was a completely new phenomenon in the television industry. On May 20th, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. This was widely cited as the first television show revival driven primarily by DVD sales. It was a paradigm shift in how the industry thought about the relationship between broadcast television and home media. The fans had spoken with their wallets, and the network had listened. Family Guy returned on May 1st, 2005 with the premiere of Season 4, and it came back strong. The post-revival seasons were, by many accounts, the best the show ever produced. Season 5 averaged 8.69 million viewers, the highest post-revival figure in the show's history. Seasons 4 through 8 are widely considered the golden age of Family Guy, the period when everything was clicking. The writing was sharp, the characters were at their best. The show had this perfect balance of absurdist humour, pop culture references, and genuine emotional moments that made it feel unique in the animated landscape. On IMDb, the per-season rating averages for seasons 2 through 5 sit around 7.5 to 7.6, which is strong for an animated comedy. The highest-rated episode in the show's entire history, Road to the Multiverse, comes from Season 8, Episode 1, and it holds a 9.1 out of 10 on IMDb. That is an exceptional rating by any standard. During this period, Family Guy won multiple Emmy Awards, earned critical praise alongside the expected criticism, and cemented its place as one of the defining shows of the 2000s. Everything seemed perfect. The show had been cancelled, brought back by the love of its fans, and was now producing some of its best work. It was a fairy tale comeback story, the kind of thing that makes you believe the audience actually has power in the entertainment industry. But something was already shifting, and the first people to really articulate what was going wrong were not Family Guy's fans. They were Family Guy's rivals. In April of 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, aired a 2-part episode that would change how people talked about Family Guy forever. And honestly, looking back, they might have been the first ones to really nail what the problem was. On April 5th, 2006, South Park aired an episode called Cartoon Wars Part 1. A week later, on April 12th, they followed it up with Cartoon Wars Part 2. On the surface, these episodes were about the controversy surrounding depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in media, inspired by a real-world incident in 2005 when a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published cartoons depicting Muhammad and sparked international protests. But the Muhammad controversy was really just the backdrop. The actual target of Cartoon Wars was Family Guy itself, and the criticism that Trey Parker and Matt Stone delivered in those 2 episodes would follow the show for the next 2 decades. To understand why South Park went after Family Guy, you have to understand the rivalry that had been simmering for years. Parker and Stone were tired of their show being grouped together with MacFarlane's. In interviews, they said that one of the meanest things anyone ever said to them was, "You guys have one of the best shows on television, you and Family Guy." They did not consider that a compliment. They considered it an insult. Parker and Stone saw their show as something fundamentally different from Family Guy, something built on character development and satirical commentary rather than random gags. Being lumped together with a show they viewed as creatively lazy drove them up the wall, so they dedicated 2 full episodes to making their case. And they did not hold back. In Cartoon Wars, the character of Eric Cartman travels to the Family Guy studio in Hollywood to try to get the show cancelled. When he arrives, he discovers something shocking. Family Guy does not employ human writers. Instead, the show is written by a group of manatees living in a large tank. These manatees swim around and push random balls into a machine. Each ball has a different word printed on it, a noun, a verb, or a pop culture reference. When the balls are fed into the machine generates a cutaway gag. That is how every joke on Family Guy gets written, according to South Park. Random animals pushing random words into a random generator. The manatee metaphor was devastating because it was so specific. It was not just saying, Family Guy is bad. It was providing an exact mechanical explanation for why the jokes feel the way they do. Random, disconnected, interchangeable. You could swap any cutaway gag from one episode into any other episode, and it would work just as well because none of them have anything to do with the actual story being told. Cartman makes this point explicitly in the episode, and according to the DVD commentary track, this speech represents Parker and Stone's actual views. Cartman says, and I am paraphrasing here, that he is nothing like Family Guy, because when he makes jokes, they are inherent to the story. He talks about deep situational and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point, as opposed to one random interchangeable joke after another. That was the core of the criticism, and it hit a nerve because it was articulate and because it came from people who clearly understood comedy on a structural level. Parker and Stone were not just saying they did not like Family Guy, they were explaining precisely what they believed was wrong with it. The jokes on Family Guy do not derive from the plot. The cutaway gags exist in a completely separate narrative universe from whatever story the episode is trying to tell. They have no emotional weight because they can never actually affect the characters or change the circumstances of the main narrative. The AV Club, in a 2011 review of the episode, described it as slyly dealing with censorship and public pressures while delivering a genuinely trenchant critique of how Family Guy constructs its humour. The thing that made Cartoon Wars so effective as criticism is that it gave viewers a vocabulary. Before those episodes aired, people either liked Family Guy or they did not. It was a matter of taste, but after Cartoon Wars, if people had specific language to describe what bothered them about the show, random, disconnected from the plot, interchangeable, no emotional stakes, written by manatees. Those phrases entered the cultural lexicon and became the default way to criticize Family Guy for the next 20 years. And here is where it gets interesting. Seth MacFarlane actually agreed with parts of the criticism. During his commencement speech at Harvard University on June 7, 2006, MacFarlane addressed the South Park parodying character as Stewie Griffin. He essentially confirmed that the cutaway gags are not in the show to advance the plot. They exist purely for the purpose of being funny. That was not a defense so much as an admission that South Park had correctly identified the show's creative philosophy, even if MacFarlane did not consider it a flaw. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, MacFarlane went further. He said he thought the South Park episode was funny and accurate, but he also said he was baffled by the personal venom that Parker and Stone directed at him in press appearances outside of the show. He drew a distinction between being parodied, which he accepted gracefully, and being personally attacked, which confused him. Family Guy eventually responded on their own terms, but it took 3 years. In the 2009 episode, Spies Reminiscent of Us, Peter Griffin attends an improv comedy show and gets the biggest laughs in the room by injecting pre-written, out-of-context gags into the performance. It was a sly acknowledgement of the criticism and simultaneously a defense. The episode was essentially saying, yeah, our jokes are random and pre-packaged, and they are funnier than your improvised, plot-driven material. Whether you agree with that take depends entirely on your personal philosophy about comedy. The Family Guy writers also adopted the manatee criticism with good humour. In their DVD commentaries, after Cartoon Wars aired, they started referring to their own jokes as manatee jokes. In the episode Family Guy Through the Years, Peter mentions that the show survived a pretty good ribbing by those South Park guys. The show seemed to genuinely take the criticism in stride, at least on the surface, but the damage was done in terms of public perception. Cartoon Wars did not just mock Family Guy, it legitimized the intellectual case against the show. Suddenly it was not just about personal taste anymore. There was a structural argument for why Family Guy was bad comedy, and that argument was being made by two of the most respected voices in adult animation, guys who had been pushing boundaries and doing ambitious storytelling for years. The timing of the criticism mattered too. By 2006, the adult animation landscape was evolving rapidly. South Park itself was moving toward more serialized storytelling, tackling topical issues with increasing sophistication. Futurama had already proven that animated comedies could do ambitious science fiction narratives with genuine emotional depth. In 2010, Archer would arrive and demonstrate that you could do rapid-fire, reference-heavy comedy while still maintaining strong character development and ongoing storylines. The bar for what adult animation could be was rising every year, and Family Guy was still doing the same thing. The cutaway gags kept coming. The structure remained essentially the same as it had been in 1999. While other shows were evolving and experimenting, Family Guy felt comfortable repeating its formula. And for a while, that formula still worked. The ratings were good, the fans were happy. But the South Park critique planted a seed that would grow into something much bigger over the following decade. Because here is the thing about the manatee metaphor. It is memorable precisely because it contains a kernel of truth that even Family Guy's creators acknowledged. The jokes are random, they are disconnected from the plot. And if you are the kind of viewer who values narrative cohesion and character-driven humour, that is a legitimate problem. If you're the kind of viewer who just wants to laugh and does not care about story structure, it is not a problem at all. Cartoon Wars did not create the divide between these two types of viewers, but it gave the first group the ammunition to win every argument. And as Family Guy continued into its post-revival years, the arguments were about to get a lot worse, because it was not just the joke structure that people were starting to complain about. Something much more fundamental was going wrong with the show. The characters that people had fallen in love with during the Golden Age were changing, and not for the better. And that transformation is what would turn casual critics into genuine haters. There is a term in television criticism called Flanderization. It is named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, and it describes what happens when a single personality trait of a complex fictional character gets exaggerated so much over time that it eventually becomes the character's only trait. Ned Flanders started out as a reasonably normal, friendly neighbour who happened to be religious. Over the years, the writers turned up the religious angle so much that eventually Ned Flanders was nothing but a religious caricature. The original character, the guy who was just a decent neighbour, was gone. Family Guy is infamous for having some of the worst cases of Flanderization in the history of animated television, and I do not say that lightly. What happened to these characters between the early seasons and the later seasons is almost hard to believe when you compare them side by side. It is like watching two completely different shows that happen to share the same character names and art style. Let's start with Peter Griffin, because his transformation is probably the most dramatic and the most damaging to the show's overall quality. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was a dim-witted but well-meaning father. He was dumb, absolutely. He made terrible decisions. He was impulsive and immature, and he had the attention span of a goldfish. But underneath all of that, there was genuine warmth. He cared about his wife. He tried in his own clumsy way to be a good dad. There is an episode early in the series where Peter literally says he would take a bullet for Meg. He had a real soft spot for his daughter, even though he did not always know how to show it. When he screwed up, and he screwed up constantly, he would usually recognize his mistake by the end of the episode and try to make things right. He was basically Homer Simpson's louder, crasser cousin, a bumbling dad archetype who meant well even when he was causing chaos. Then something changed. The shift started becoming noticeable around season 8, and by the time you get to season 10 and beyond, Peter Griffin is essentially a different character. He went from being a lovable idiot to what fans and critics describe as a psychopathic man-child. His intelligence did not just drop, it cratered. Early Peter was dumb. Later Peter is so aggressively stupid that it defies any suspension of disbelief. Even for a cartoon, he does not just make bad decisions anymore. He actively causes harm to the people around him and seems to enjoy it. He physically abuses his family. He has shot his friends on multiple occasions. He torments Meg relentlessly, not in the playful, teasing way a dad might, but in genuinely cruel ways that would constitute abuse in any real-world context. The show tries to excuse Peter's behaviour by chalking it up to stupidity, but that explanation does not hold up when you watch the episodes. A lot of what Peter does in the later seasons is not stupid. It is sadistic. He is not accidentally hurting people because he does not know better. He is hurting people because the writers think cruelty is funny. The Peter Griffin who would take a bullet for Meg became the Peter Griffin who makes jokes about wanting Meg to die. That is not character development. That is character assassination. And Peter is not even the worst case. That distinction might belong to Brian Griffin. Brian in the early seasons was one of the best characters on the show. He was this dry, sardonic, slightly pretentious talking dog who served as the family's voice of reason. He was flawed, sure. He drank too much. He was a bit full of himself. He had delusions about being a great writer, but those flaws were endearing because they were balanced by genuine intelligence, real empathy, and a sincere desire to do the right thing. His dynamic with Stewie, in particular, was the heart of the show. The odd couple pairing of a megalomaniacal genius baby and a world-weary intellectual dog produced some of the best episodes in the entire series. Starting around season 9, Brian was Flanderized into someone almost unrecognizable. The slight pretentiousness became full-blown, insufferable narcissism. He was no longer a dog who happened to be somewhat pretentious. He was nothing but pretension. The writers turned him into a character who would lie, manipulate, and use anyone around him, especially women, to serve his own ego. He became a political soapbox for the writers' views, delivering lectures about atheism and liberalism that felt less like character dialogue and more like someone reading a blog post out loud. His flaws stopped being endearing and started being genuinely repulsive. There is a famous scene in the episode Jerome is the New Black, where Quagmire, of all people, delivers this brutal speech about everything he hates about Brian. He calls him the worst person he knows. He says Brian constantly hits on his best friend's wife, never pays for anything, gives himself credit for being an intellectual when he's never actually accomplished anything, and uses women as disposable objects. The speech resonated so deeply with fans because every single word of it was accurate. The writers had turned Brian into exactly the kind of person Quagmire described, and then they had Quagmire say out loud what the audience was already feeling. Brian's death in the season 12. Episode Life of Brian was the culmination of this frustration. The show killed Brian off by having him get hit by a car, and the initial fan reaction was a mix of shock and something close to relief. A lot of people felt that Brian had become so insufferable that his death was almost welcome. But then the show brought him back just 3 episodes later in Christmas Guy, and the whole thing was widely perceived as a cynical ratings grab. Life of Brian is one of the lowest rated episodes in the show's history on IMDb. People felt manipulated, and they were probably right. Meg's Flanderization is different from Peter's and Brian's, but in some ways it is even more upsetting. In the early seasons, Meg was just an awkward teenage girl trying to navigate high school and fit in with her peers. She was not popular, but she had friends. She had a recognizable human experience that a lot of viewers could relate to. She was the every girl character, the one who grounded the show in something resembling normal teenage reality. What the writers did to Meg over the later seasons is genuinely difficult to watch. She went from being a relatable underdog to being the designated victim of the entire cast. Every character on the show, including her own parents, treats Meg with open contempt and disgust for no discernible reason. The show stopped making jokes about Meg being unpopular and started making jokes about Meg being subhuman. Peter tells her she is ugly. Lois ignores her. Chris joins in on the bullying. Even strangers on the street seem to hate Meg on sight. It stopped being comedy and started feeling like the writers had a personal vendetta against this fictional teenage girl. The worst example of this is the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In this episode, Meg finally snaps and stands up to her family. She calls them out for years of abuse and neglect. She tells Peter he is a terrible father. She tells Lois she is selfish and neglectful. She tells Chris he is just as bad as their parents. For a few minutes, it feels like the show is finally going to address the Meg problem and give her some dignity. But then the episode takes this bizarre turn where Brian convinces Meg that she needs to go back to being the family's punching bag. He tells her that the family needs someone to absorb all their dysfunction and that someone is Meg. She accepts this role and goes back to being abused, and the episode frames this as a mature and selfless decision. It is one of the most baffling creative choices in the show's history, and it made a lot of fans genuinely angry. Stewie's transformation was less malicious but still significant. In the early seasons, Stewie was this brilliant, evil baby who spoke with an exaggerated mid-Atlantic accent and spent every episode plotting to kill his mother and achieve world domination. It was an absurd premise, but it worked because the contrast between his tiny baby body and his megalomaniacal personality was inherently funny. The writers eventually decided they had exhausted the evil baby concept and gradually softened Stewie into Brian's effeminate sidekick. While Stewie became more likable in some ways, he lost the edge that made him iconic. The Stewie who plotted global takeover became the Stewie who went on buddy comedy road trips with Brian. Some fans welcomed the change, others felt the character had been neutered. Chris was Flanderized from a kind, slightly dim-witted teenager with genuine artistic talent into a character defined almost entirely by stupidity and crude humour. Around season 11, he started joining his family in being cruel to Meg, which was a total reversal from the earlier seasons, where the two siblings had a normal relationship with typical sibling rivalry, but no genuine malice. When you add all of these character changes together, you get a show that kept the names and the voices and the art style, but fundamentally replaced the cast. The characters that people fell in love with during seasons 1 through 5 effectively do not exist anymore. They have been replaced by louder, meaner, more one-dimensional versions of themselves. And for fans who had been watching since the beginning, who had bought those DVDs and campaigned for the show's return, this felt like a betrayal. They did not bring back the show they loved. They brought back a show wearing its skin. This is the part of the Family Guy story that hurts the most, because it is personal. When a show's joke format gets criticised, that is an intellectual debate. When a show's characters get destroyed, that is an emotional loss. People cared about early Peter, early Brian, early Meg. They saw themselves in those characters. Watching them get twisted into something unrecognisable is not just disappointing. It is painful in the way that only happens when something you loved turns into something you cannot defend anymore. But there is a reason the characters changed so dramatically, and that reason is connected to what was happening behind the scenes. Because while the characters were getting worse on screen, the guy who created them was quietly stepping back from the show. And when Seth MacFarlane became less involved, Family Guy lost something it could never get back. Here is something that will surprise a lot of people. Seth MacFarlane, the guy whose name is synonymous with Family Guy, the guy whose voice comes out of Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire, and about a dozen other characters, has only been credited with writing 3 episodes in the entire history of the series. 3. Out of over 400 episodes spanning more than 2 decades, he has not written a single episode since 2005. Think about what that means. The man who created Family Guy, the man whose creative vision defined the show's earliest and best seasons, effectively stopped writing for it right around the time the show came back from cancellation. All of those post-revival episodes that fans love, all of the Golden Age material from seasons 4 through 8, and all of the later seasons that fans criticise, those were all written by other people. MacFarlane was still there. He was still doing the voices. He was still listed as an executive producer, but he was not in the writer's room crafting stories and jokes the way he had been during the show's inception. The reason for this is straightforward. MacFarlane is one of the busiest people in Hollywood, and his ambitions extend far beyond a single animated sitcom. After Family Guy came back from cancellation, MacFarlane's career exploded in multiple directions simultaneously. He co-created American Dad, which premiered on Fox in 2005. He launched The Cleveland Show in 2009, a Family Guy spin-off that ran for 4 seasons. He wrote, directed, and starred in the film Ted in 2012, which grossed almost $550 million worldwide on a $50 million budget. He followed that up with Ted 2 in 2015 and A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014. He created and starred in The Orville, a live-action science fiction series that premiered in 2017. He launched the Ted prequel series on Peacock in 2024, which was renewed for a second season, premiering in March 2026. He hosted the 85th Academy Awards in 2013. He signed a massive overall deal with NBC Universal in 2020, reported to be a 5-year contract estimated at $200 million. The man is a machine, but there are only 24 hours in a day, and when you're writing movies, producing multiple television shows, starring in a live-action series, recording albums, and managing a production company, something has to give. For MacFarlane, the thing that gave was his day-to-day involvement with Family Guy. The show's executive producers and co-showrunners, Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, have spoken about this openly. In a 2022 interview, Sulkin described how the relationship with MacFarlane has evolved over the years. When he first came on the show, MacFarlane was incredibly hands-on. As the years went on, his time became increasingly precious. Sulkin explained that they have a great relationship with MacFarlane, but that he comes in and does the voices, lets them know what he likes and does not like about the show, and occasionally pitches a story idea that goes straight into the pipeline. But the creative heavy lifting falls on the showrunners and the writing staff. Rich Appel added that MacFarlane is more or less required to stay informed about what is happening on the show because he voices so many of the characters. When you're playing Peter, Brian, Stewie, Quagmire, and a host of recurring characters, you need to know what's going on in the scripts even if you're not the one writing them. But knowing what is going on and actively shaping the creative direction are two very different things. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not saying that MacFarlane abandoned Family Guy or that he does not care about it. The man still shows up every week to record voices. He still gives notes and feedback. He is still emotionally invested in the show's quality, but there is a tangible difference between a show run by its creator and a show run by people who work for its creator. The original vision, the specific sensibility that made early Family Guy feel like something only Seth MacFarlane could have made, that gets diluted when the creator steps back. You can see this dynamic play out in MacFarlane's own frustrations with the network that airs his show. In 2021, after a Tucker Carlson segment on Fox News that MacFarlane found objectionable, he tweeted that Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He said, "Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore." MacFarlane has been vocal about his discomfort with being associated with Fox News, even though Fox Broadcasting and Fox News are technically separate entities. The fact that MacFarlane, the creator of the show, was publicly expressing a desire to leave the network that airs it tells you something about how complicated his relationship with Family Guy had become. During the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, MacFarlane walked out of production on Family Guy alongside showrunners Appel and Sulkin on May 12, 2023. He donated $1 million to the Entertainment Community Fund to support film and television workers during the strike. This was not the first time a writers' strike had affected the show. During the 2007 to 2008 WGA strike, Fox aired 3 incomplete episodes of Family Guy without MacFarlane's final approval or voice mixing, a decision that MacFarlane publicly condemned as damaging to his relationship with the network. The financial structure of the show also reveals how MacFarlane's role has evolved. The budget for Family Guy is approximately $2 million per episode. The core voice actors, including Alex Borstein, who plays Lois, Seth Green, who plays Chris, Mila Kunis, who plays Meg, and Mike Henry, who plays Cleveland, renegotiated their salaries to somewhere between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode. MacFarlane, despite voicing more characters than anyone else on the show, allocated himself just $50,000 per episode, strictly for his vocal performances. His real income from the show comes through his executive producer credit and his overall deal with the production company, not from the voice work itself. That pay structure reflects a creator who has diversified his income streams to the point where the voice acting is almost a side job. The impact of MacFarlane's reduced involvement on the show's quality is a matter of debate, and reasonable people can disagree about it, but there is a correlation that is hard to ignore. The seasons that fans love the most, seasons 4 through 8, correspond roughly to the period when MacFarlane was most engaged with the show after the revival. The decline that fans identify starting around seasons 8 through 10 and accelerating from there corresponds to the period when MacFarlane was increasingly pulled away by his expanding list of projects. When a show loses its creator's active voice, the writing room tends to default to what is easiest. In Family Guy's case, what is easiest is more cutaway gags, more shock humour, more formulaic episode structures. The things that South Park criticised become more prominent, because those are the tools that our writing staff reaches for when they do not have a singular creative vision guiding them. It is not that Apple and Sulkin are bad showrunners. They are clearly competent professionals who have kept a show running for years. But they are not Seth MacFarlane, and the show they're making is not the same show he would make if he was still fully invested in every episode. There is an irony in all of this that is worth noting. American Dad, which MacFarlane also co-created, is frequently cited by fans as the superior show. It has stronger character development, less reliance on cutaway gags, and more consistent writing quality across its seasons. Many fans of adult animation openly say that American Dad is what Family Guy should have been. The irony is that MacFarlane created both shows. He had the formula for something better. He demonstrated it with American Dad. But Family Guy, the show that made him famous, never got the same level of sustained creative attention. The Seth MacFarlane factor is important because it explains so much about the show's trajectory. The golden age happened when MacFarlane was engaged. The decline happened when he stepped back. The characters got worse because the writers who remained defaulted to easy humour instead of nuanced characterisation. The joke structure ossified because nobody with the authority to change it was pushing for evolution. MacFarlane's departure was not sudden or dramatic. It was a slow fade, a gradual withdrawal of creative energy that left the show running on institutional momentum rather than artistic inspiration. And this creative vacuum did not exist in isolation. While Family Guy was losing its creator's active involvement and defaulting to its easiest instincts, the world around the show was changing dramatically. The cultural landscape that had given birth to Family Guy in the late 90s, a landscape where transgressive humour was celebrated and boundary pushing was rewarded, was transforming into something very different. And Family Guy, a show built entirely on pushing boundaries, suddenly found itself on the wrong side of a cultural shift it did not know how to navigate. Family Guy was born in a very specific cultural moment. The late 90s and early 2000s were a time when American comedy was actively rebelling against what a lot of people saw as enforced niceness. The Reagan era of the 80s had produced this wave of manufactured wholesomeness in popular culture. All these squeaky clean family sitcoms and after-school specials and feel-good messaging. By the mid-90s, comedians and television creators were pushing back hard against that sanitized version of America. South Park debuted in 1997. Jackass was a cultural phenomenon. Tom Green was on MTV doing things that would get you arrested today. There was this energy in comedy that said, nothing is sacred, everything is fair game, and if you are offended, that is your problem. Seth MacFarlane, who was born in 1973 and grew up watching the blandness of the classic American sitcom, was perfectly positioned to ride that wave. Family Guy opened with a riff on the title sequence from All in the Family, and then exploded into a glitzy song and dance number about restoring good old-fashioned values. The irony was baked in from the very first frame. This was a show that was going to mock the idea of traditional values while simultaneously being broadcast into traditional American living rooms. It was provocative by design, and in 1999, that provocation was exactly what audiences wanted. The show's operating philosophy was often described as equal opportunity offense. The idea was simple. Family Guy makes fun of everyone. Christians, Jews, Muslims, black people, white people, disabled people, gay people, straight people, Democrats, Republicans, celebrities, politicians, children, elderly people. Nobody was safe. And the logic was that if everyone gets mocked, then nobody is truly being singled out. The playing field is level because the show is equally cruel to all groups. This philosophy gave Family Guy an armour of sorts. Whenever anyone complained about a specific joke, the defence was always the same. We make fun of everybody. For a long time, that defence worked. Family Guy thrived in the early 2000s because the culture was broadly receptive to transgressive humour. The show's audience understood the contract. You tune in, you accept that everything is going to get roasted, you laugh at the jokes that land, and you roll your eyes at the ones that do not. It was a shared understanding between the show and its viewers that made the whole thing function. But culture does not stand still. And somewhere around the early 2000s, the cultural ground beneath Family Guy started shifting in ways that the show was not equipped to handle. The conversation around comedy started to change. Social media gave people platforms to express their discomfort with specific types of jokes in ways that had not been possible before. What used to be a private eye roll at an offensive joke became a public conversation about who gets hurt when certain topics are treated as punchlines. The question stopped being, is this joke funny? And started being, who does this joke punch down on? The concept of punching down, making jokes at the expense of people who already face discrimination or marginalisation, became a central part of how people evaluated comedy. Family Guy, a show that had built its entire identity on punching in every direction, simultaneously, was suddenly being evaluated through a lens that distinguished between punching up and punching down. And when people applied that lens to the show's joke catalogue, a lot of what they found was uncomfortable. The show's treatment of Joe Swanson is a good example. Joe is a recurring character who uses a wheelchair, and one of the show's longest-running joke categories involves making fun of his disability. In the early seasons, Joe's disability was part of his character, but not the entirety of it. He was a tough, competent police officer who happened to be in a wheelchair. Over time, the wheelchair jokes became more frequent, more crude, and more central to Joe's presence on the show. By the later seasons, it felt like Joe existed primarily so the writers could make disability jokes. For audiences who had friends or family members with disabilities or who were disabled themselves, this was not just unfunny, it was hurtful. The religious humour aged similarly. Family Guy loved taking shots at every religion. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all got roasted regularly. Some of those jokes were genuinely clever satire that made pointed observations about religious institutions and hypocrisy. Others were just cheap shots designed to provoke a reaction. As society became more aware of the real-world consequences of religious discrimination and the way certain communities were being targeted, some of those jokes started reading less like equal opportunity satire and more like casual cruelty directed at people's deeply held beliefs. In January 2019, the show attempted to address this directly. In the episode Trump Guy, which premiered on January 13th, Peter Griffin told a cartoon President Trump that the show was trying to phase out gay jokes. This was confirmed by executive producers Alex Sulkin and Rich Appel, as well as creator Seth MacFarlane. It was presented as the show evolving with the times, acknowledging that jokes targeting gay people were no longer acceptable even within Family Guy's anything goes framework. The reception was mixed, to put it generously. Some people praised the decision as a step in the right direction. Others pointed out the awkwardness of a show that had built its brand on offensive humour, suddenly deciding that one category of offensive humour was off limits. If gay jokes were wrong, why were disability jokes still fine? If the show was capable of recognising that certain jokes cause harm, why was it still mocking every other marginalised group? The selective reform pleased nobody. Fans who loved the show's transgressive edge felt it was going soft. People who had been critical of the show's offensive content felt the change was too little, too late, and did not address the deeper issues. The recasting of Cleveland Brown's voice in 2020 followed a similar pattern. Mike Henry, a white actor, had voiced the black character of Cleveland Brown since the show's inception. In the wake of the cultural reckoning around racial representation following the murder of George Floyd, Henry stepped down from the role. The decision was part of a broader industry trend where white actors voluntarily gave up voice roles for characters of colour on animated shows. Again, the reception was split. Some praised it as a long overdue correction. Others questioned why it had taken over 20 years for anyone to consider this a problem. Family Guy found itself trapped in this no man's land between its past and its present. The show's DNA was built on transgressive humour. That was the whole point. That was why it existed. Removing the transgression meant removing the show's fundamental identity, but keeping the transgression in a cultural environment that was increasingly hostile to that kind of humour meant constant backlash and criticism. There was no move the show could make that would satisfy everyone, because the two sides of its audience wanted fundamentally incompatible things. This is the paradox that a lot of long-running comedies face, but it hit Family Guy especially hard because the show had never developed other strengths to fall back on. The Simpsons had its heart, South Park had its topical relevance, Futurama had its science fiction concepts and emotional storytelling. Family Guy had its willingness to go further than anyone else. When the culture decided that going further was not always a virtue, Family Guy did not have a second gear. The broader animation landscape made this problem worse. By the early 2020s, adult animation was experiencing a renaissance of sorts. Shows like Invincible, Arcane, and Primal were demonstrating that animation could tell sophisticated, emotionally complex stories for adult audiences without relying on shock value or cheap laughs. These shows treated their characters with respect, gave them genuine arcs and development, and trusted their audiences to engage with mature themes through storytelling rather than provocation. Family Guy's format, with its disconnected cutaway gags and flanderized characters and shock-for-shock's sake humour, felt increasingly outdated by comparison. The episodes that the PTC had been complaining about for years started looking different in this new context. The show that had survived partial terms of endearment being refused by Fox for its abortion themes, that had weathered the pulling of Turban Cowboy from syndication after the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing because of a coincidental cutaway gag about the Boston Marathon. that had shrugged off decades of FCC complaints and advertiser pressure. This show was now facing criticism not from conservative watchdog groups, but from its own potential audience. The call was coming from inside the house. And yet, through all of this cultural turbulence, something genuinely bizarre was happening with Family Guy's viewership numbers. Because while the criticism was getting louder and the cultural headwinds were getting stronger, the show was quietly becoming one of the most watched programs in the entire streaming ecosystem. The show that everyone claimed to hate was being consumed in absolutely massive quantities. And that contradiction is one of the strangest things in all of modern television. Here is where the Family Guy story gets really weird, because the numbers tell a completely different story than the internet discourse. Let me walk you through the viewership decline first, because it is real and it is dramatic. Season 1, which premiered in 1999, averaged 14.12 million viewers per episode and was ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings. After the revival, Season 5 peaked at 8.69 million viewers, which was the high watermark for the post-cancellation era. From there, the decline was steady and relentless. Season 10 averaged 7.30 million. Season 15 dropped to 3.93 million. Season 20 fell to 1.90 million. And by Season 22, the show was averaging just 1.44 million viewers per episode on linear television. If you only looked at those numbers, you would conclude that Family Guy is a dying show watched by a shrinking audience of holdouts who have not figured out how to use their remote. And that would be completely wrong. Because those numbers only tell you what is happening on broadcast television, and broadcast television is not where people watch Family Guy anymore. In the first half of 2025, Family Guy ranked as the 4th most streamed television show across all digital platforms. 4th, out of every show available on every streaming service. It has consistently been one of the top streamed shows on Hulu for multiple years running. When you combine its streaming numbers with its syndication presence across Adult Swim, which aired the show from 2003 to 2021 and announced a return in 2025, Comedy Central, which struck a licensing deal with Disney, announced in August 2024, with broadcast beginning September 2024, TBS, FXX, and Freeform, the actual audience for Family Guy is enormous. It dwarfs the linear television numbers by an absurd margin. The show has also expanded into new content formats specifically designed for streaming audiences. Hulu premiered a Family Guy Halloween special on October 14th, 2024, followed by a Christmas special called Gift of the White Guy on November 25th, 2024. These are not episodes of the regular series. They are standalone specials produced specifically for the streaming platform, which tells you that the people making business decisions at Disney and Hulu see enough demand for Family Guy content to invest in creating new material beyond the standard broadcast season. So what is going on here? How can a show be simultaneously one of the most criticized programs in existence and one of the most watched? The answer lies in understanding that the people who talk about Family Guy online and the people who actually watch Family Guy are largely two different audiences having two completely different experiences with the same show. The people who hate Family Guy on the internet are, by and large, people who are engaging with the show critically. They are thinking about joke construction, character development, narrative structure, cultural impact. They are comparing Family Guy to other animated shows and finding it wanting. They are remembering what the show used to be and mourning what it has become. These are people for whom watching television is an active, analytical experience. They think about what they watch, they form opinions about it, and they share those opinions online. The people who are streaming Family Guy in massive numbers are engaging with it in a completely different way. They are putting it on while they do laundry. They are falling asleep to it. They are scrolling their phones with Family Guy playing in the background. They are using it as audio wallpaper during boring tasks. They are watching random episodes, out of order, picking up wherever Hulu's autoplay drops them, and not caring about character arcs or joke quality because they are not really paying close attention in the first place. And honestly, Family Guy is almost perfectly designed for this kind of consumption. The episodes are short, the format is episodic, which means you do not need to follow a serialized plot to understand what is happening. The characters are familiar and unchanging, which is comforting even if the lack of change is exactly what critics complain about. The cutaway gag structure means there is a new joke every 30 seconds, so even if you are only half listening, something will eventually make you chuckle. The show's rhythm is predictable and soothing in a way that works really well as background noise. This is actually the context you're experiencing right now if you're listening to this video as a sleep aid. Long-form content about familiar topics, delivered in a calm and conversational tone, works incredibly well for relaxation and sleep. Family Guy itself functions this way for millions of people. They do not watch it because they think it is great television. They watch it because it is comfortable and familiar, and it fills a silence that would otherwise be empty. There is a term for this kind of content consumption, and it is becoming increasingly important in the streaming era. It is called background viewing, and it represents a huge portion of the total watch time on platforms like Hulu and Netflix. Background viewing is fundamentally different from active viewing in terms of what the audience wants from the content. Active viewers want quality, novelty, emotional engagement, intellectual stimulation. Background viewers want reliability, familiarity, comfort, and a steady stream of content that does not demand their full attention. Family Guy is elite background television. It might actually be the best background television show ever made, and the streaming numbers reflect that. The show does not need to be critically acclaimed or culturally relevant or even particularly good to generate massive streaming numbers. It just needs to be there, reliably producing content that people can half-watch while they fold their socks. The awards tell a similar story of institutional momentum. Over its run, Family Guy has accumulated over 91 nominations and 24 or more wins across all organisations. It has earned 32 Primetime Emmy nominations and won 9 of them. Seth MacFarlane personally won the Outstanding Voiceover Performance Emmy in 2016, 2017 and 2019. Alex Borstein won the same category in 2018. The show continues to be recognised by the industry even as critics and online commentators declare it dead. The Metacritic scores capture this split perfectly. The show holds a 58 out of 100 from professional critics, which is categorised as mixed or average. But the user score is 6.6 out of 10, categorised as generally favourable. Critics who engage with the show analytically find it mediocre. Audiences who engage with it more casually find it generally enjoyable. Both groups are watching the same show and arriving at legitimately different conclusions based on the way they are consuming it. The Rotten Tomatoes scores vary so wildly by season that they barely function as a useful metric. Season 1 sits at approximately 46% from critics. Season 4 jumps to 80%. Season 10 drops to 50%. Season 11 somehow hits 100%. Season 14 falls back to the 50 to 60% range. Season 16 pops back up to 100%. The audience scores are generally higher, sitting around 80 to 90% across most seasons. What these numbers really show is that professional critical opinion on Family Guy is wildly inconsistent, which makes sense given that the show's quality varies enormously from episode to episode, even within the same season. The streaming paradox also explains why Fox and Disney continue to invest in Family Guy despite the negative discourse. They do not care about Reddit threads or YouTube essays. They care about engagement metrics and streaming numbers, and by those measures, Family Guy is one of the most valuable properties in their animated portfolio. The show generates consistent, reliable viewership that translates directly into subscription retention for Hulu and advertising revenue for the broadcast and syndication windows. This creates a feedback loop that virtually guarantees the show will continue for the foreseeable future, regardless of critical reception. As long as people keep streaming Family Guy, there is no business incentive to cancel it. And people will keep streaming it because it functions as background content, which means its audience is not dependent on quality. You do not need to make a good episode of Family Guy to get someone to stream it while they are cooking dinner. You just need to make an episode, any episode. The bar for continued existence has dropped from this needs to be good to this needs to exist, and Family Guy clears that bar every single week. The paradox of Family Guy in the streaming age is that the show's declining quality might actually be a feature rather than a bug when it comes to background viewing. A show that is too good demands your attention. A show that is consistently mediocre can be ignored without guilt. Family Guy has found its niche not as a show people watch, but as a show people have on. And in the attention economy of the 2020s, being something people have on is worth more than being something a smaller number of people actively engage with. But the streaming numbers, impressive as they are, do not erase the genuine frustration that a lot of fans feel. Because underneath the paradox of massive viewership and widespread hatred, there are specific episodes and specific moments that crystallize the criticism into something sharp and permanent. These are the episodes that turned casual disappointment into active resentment. The ones that broke the relationship between the show and the fans who had once loved it enough to bring it back from the dead. Every long-running show has bad episodes. That is unavoidable when you're producing over 20 episodes per season for more than 2 decades. The Simpsons has bad episodes. South Park has bad episodes. Even prestige dramas have weak entries that fans prefer to forget about. What separates a show that has some bad episodes from a show that becomes hated is whether those bad episodes represent isolated mistakes or a pattern. In Family Guy's case, the bad episodes form a very clear pattern, and that pattern accelerated over time until the bad episodes were not the exception anymore. They were the norm. I already mentioned Seahorse Seashell Party and the way it handled Meg's abuse. So let me move to some other examples that illustrate different dimensions of the problem. Peter Asment from Season 8 is frequently cited as the episode where the seasonal rot truly kicked in. The premise involves Peter's boss, Angela, sexually harassing him at work. That is a topic that could, in theory, be handled with the kind of sharp satirical edge that early Family Guy was capable of delivering. Instead, the episode treats the situation as a prolonged joke about how unattractive Angela is, and how horrified Peter is by her advances. The sexual harassment is not satirized or deconstructed. It is played for uncomfortable laughs that never really land. The episode marks a shift in the show's sensibility, a move away from humor that has a point toward humor that simply exists to provoke discomfort without any underlying commentary. Fresh Hair from Season 12 is considered by many fans to be the single worst episode in Family Guy's history. The premise involves Peter attempting to marry his own son Chris in order to inherit money. The incest angle is played entirely for shock value, with no satirical framework, no commentary on anything, just the raw provocation of a father trying to marry his child, played as comedy. Even by Family Guy's standards, Fresh Air crossed a line that most viewers found impossible to laugh at. It represents the show at its absolute worst, deploying shock for the sake of shock, without any of the wit or cleverness that once made the show's transgressive humour work. The life of Brian's saga from Season 12 is worth examining in more detail because it reveals how the show's relationship with its audience had become fundamentally broken. On November 24th, 2013, Family Guy aired an episode in which Brian Griffin was struck by a car and killed. The family mourned him briefly, and a new dog named Vinny was introduced as his replacement. The internet erupted. Fans were furious, devastated, and confused. Brian was one of the most beloved characters on the show, and killing him off felt like a betrayal of the audience's investment in the character. Then on December 15th, just 3 episodes later, Brian was brought back to life in the Christmas special through a time travel plot involving Stewie. The whole death had been a stunt. Brian was never going to stay dead. The show had manufactured a crisis, milked it for attention and social media discourse for 3 weeks, and then reversed it as if nothing had happened. The backlash to this arc was intense. Life of Brian holds one of the lowest ratings in the show's history on IMDb. Fans accused the writers of executing a cynical ratings grab, using a beloved character's death to generate buzz and then undoing it without any lasting consequences. The move undermined trust in the show. If the writers were willing to fake kill a main character just for attention, then nothing on the show carried emotional weight. Any dramatic moment could be reversed. Any character development could be undone. The show had revealed that it did not take its own stories seriously, and it expected the audience to just go along with the manipulation. You Can't Handle the Booth, from season 17, holds the distinction of being the lowest rated episode in the show's entire history on IMDb, sitting at approximately 4.2 out of 10. The episode uses a meta-commentary gimmick where the voice actors watch and comment on an episode of Family Guy. It is the kind of self-referential concept that can work in the right hands, but in this case, the execution frustrated viewers who felt the show was disappearing up its own navel instead of telling an actual story. The episode's abysmal rating reflects a specific kind of fan anger, the anger that comes from feeling like the show is actively wasting your time. Beyond these individual episodes, there are broader patterns in the later seasons that contribute to the perception that Family Guy has fallen off a cliff. The escalation of violence is one of the most noticeable changes. Early Family Guy used violence sparingly, and usually for absurdist comic effect. The chicken fights between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken were a highlight of the show because they were unexpected, over the top, and rare enough to feel special when they happened. In the later seasons, graphic violence became routine. Characters get bones protruding through their skin. Peter disembowels a beached whale with a forklift. Bodies are maimed, mutilated, and destroyed in increasingly graphic ways that are played for shock rather than comedy. The violence stopped being funny because it stopped being surprising. When every episode features someone getting graphically injured, the shock value evaporates, and all you are left with is unpleasantness. The sexual content followed a similar trajectory. Early Family Guy had sexual jokes, but they were usually delivered through implication or wordplay. The later seasons became increasingly explicit, pushing into territory that felt gratuitous rather than humorous. It is the same problem as the violence. When you escalate constantly without restraint, you eventually reach a point where the only way to maintain the shock is to go somewhere genuinely uncomfortable. And the show crossed that line repeatedly. Plot recycling became endemic in the later seasons. Brian finding a new girlfriend who dumps him by the end of the episode became such a common storyline that fans could predict it from the cold open. Stewie and Brian time travel episodes, while once a beloved format, became repetitive. Peter doing something catastrophically stupid in the first act, which is then completely forgotten by the halfway point to make room for an unrelated B-plot, became the default episode structure. The writers even started reusing jokes from earlier seasons, including variations on the chicken fights that had diminishing returns each time. Filler became a defining characteristic of the later seasons in a way it never was during the Golden Age. Family Guy has to fill 22 minutes of runtime per episode, and when the writers run out of material, they pad episodes with extended gags that serve no purpose other than eating clock. The Conway Twitty cutaway is the most famous example. The show would literally play an entire Conway Twitty music performance, sometimes lasting over a minute, as a substitute for writing actual jokes. Extended injury sequences where a character would spend 30 seconds or more making pained noises after a fall became another common filler technique. These moments feel like the show is admitting in real time that it has nothing to say. The treatment of continuity, or rather, the complete disregard for it, also frustrated viewers who were paying attention. Family Guy has always been loose with continuity, and that was part of its charm in the early seasons. Characters could die in one episode and be alive in the next. The town of Quahog could be destroyed and rebuilt between scenes. That anarchic approach to reality was part of what made the show feel free and unpredictable. But in the later seasons, the lack of continuity started feeling less like creative freedom and more like laziness. Characters would undergo major life changes that were completely forgotten by the next episode. Emotional revelations would be made and then ignored. The show was not just loose with continuity, it was actively contemptuous of the idea that anything that happened on screen mattered. This accumulation of problems, the bad episodes, the escalating shock value, the recycled plots, the filler, the broken continuity, the character assassinations, created a compound effect that was worse than the sum of its parts. Each individual issue might have been forgivable on its own. A bad episode here, a recycled plot there, an overly graphic scene every once in a while. But when all of these problems are happening simultaneously in nearly every episode, the show becomes genuinely unpleasant to watch for anyone who is paying attention. And that phrase, anyone who is paying attention, is key, because as we discussed in the streaming section, a lot of Family Guy's current audience is not paying close attention. They are background viewers who do not notice the recycled plots or the filler or the broken continuity because they are not tracking those things. The people who notice, the people who are paying attention, are the ones who end up hating the show. The more closely you watch Family Guy, the more problems you see. And the more problems you see, the angrier you get, especially if you remember how good the show used to be. These episodes and patterns did not just damage the show's reputation in isolation. They contributed to a broader narrative about Family Guy's place in the animated landscape. Because while Family Guy was struggling with declining quality and internal creative problems, other shows were thriving and evolving in ways that made Family Guy look even worse by comparison. The competition was not standing still, and every step they took forward made Family Guy's stagnation more obvious. To understand how Family Guy became hated, you have to understand what was happening around it. Because Family Guy did not decline in a vacuum. It declined while every other show in the adult animation space was getting better. And when the shows around you are improving while you're getting worse, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Let's start with the most obvious comparison: The Simpsons. The Simpsons has faced many of the same criticisms as Family Guy. Declining quality, flanderized characters, a show that has been on too long and cannot recapture its glory days. But there is a crucial difference in how these two shows are perceived, and that difference is about legacy and emotional cushion. The Simpsons built up so much cultural goodwill during its golden age, roughly seasons 3 through 8, that it earned the right to coast. Even the most vocal Simpsons critics will acknowledge that the show's best episodes are among the greatest achievements in the history of television comedy. When people complain about modern Simpsons, they do so with a tone of sadness rather than anger. It is like watching a legendary athlete play past their prime. You feel bad for them, but you still respect what they accomplished. Family Guy never built up that same level of critical respect. Its golden age was shorter, its critical reputation was always more contested, and it had already been cancelled once before it even had a chance to establish a long-term legacy. So when the quality started declining, there was less goodwill in the bank to draw from. The criticism hit harder because there was less affection cushioning the blow. The really painful comparison for Family Guy fans is not The Simpsons though, it is American Dad. American Dad premiered in 2005, also co-created by Seth MacFarlane, along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. On paper it sounds like Family Guy with a different coat of paint. It is another animated sitcom about an obnoxious father, his family, and some absurd characters living in their house. But American Dad took a fundamentally different approach to comedy and character development, and over time it became widely regarded as the superior show. The key difference is that American Dad relies far less on cutaway gags. The humour in American Dad grows organically from the characters and situations. Stan Smith is as ridiculous as Peter Griffin, but his absurdity is connected to his personality and his worldview in ways that Peter's often is not. Roger, the alien living in the family's attic, is one of the most creative characters in modern animation, adopting hundreds of different personas that all serve specific story purposes. Klaus, the German fish, Steve's nerdy high school experiences, Haley's political activism, all of these characters and storylines evolved and developed over time in ways that Family Guy's characters simply did not. Fans noticed this. It became a common sentiment online that American Dad was what Family Guy should have been, or more precisely, what Family Guy could have been if its writers had put the same effort into character development and story-driven humour. The irony, as I mentioned earlier, is that MacFarlane co-created both shows. He had the formula for something better. He proved it with American Dad, but he never brought that formula back to Family Guy, possibly because Family Guy was already too established in its format to change, or possibly because he was too busy with other projects to push for that kind of overhaul. Bob's Burgers arrived on Fox in 2011 and offered another devastating comparison. Created by Lauren Bouchard, Bob's Burgers is an animated family sitcom about a working-class family running a struggling restaurant. It is a much quieter, gentler show than Family Guy, and that gentleness turned out to be its greatest strength. The Belcher family genuinely loves each other. The parents support their kids. The kids are weird and awkward, but they are not punching bags. Conflicts arise from the situations the family finds themselves in, not from the characters being cruel to each other. For viewers who had grown tired of Family Guy's mean-spirited humour and abusive character dynamics, Bob's Burgers was a revelation. Here was an animated family sitcom that could be funny without being cruel, that could deal with real family dynamics without resorting to shock value, and that treated its characters like actual human beings rather than vessels for joke delivery. Bob's Burgers demonstrated that warmth and humour were not mutually exclusive, and it made Family Guy's reliance on cruelty look like a creative choice rather than a necessity. Archer debuted on FX in 2010 and showed that you could do rapid-fire, reference-heavy comedy, the exact thing Family Guy was known for, while still maintaining strong character development and ongoing storylines. Archer's jokes were as dense and fast-paced as anything on Family Guy, but they were anchored to specific characters with consistent personalities, specific relationships with specific dynamics, and specific ongoing conflicts that evolved over time. When Archer made a pop culture reference, it was usually filtered through a character's specific knowledge and personality. When Family Guy made a pop culture reference, it was usually a cutaway gag that any character could have delivered because it had nothing to do with the character saying it. The prestige animation wave of the 2020s widened the gap even further. Shows like Invincible on Amazon Prime demonstrated that animated superhero stories could have the emotional weight and narrative complexity of the best live-action dramas. Arcane on Netflix raised the bar for animated storytelling so dramatically that it won Emmy Awards in categories typically dominated by live-action prestige television. Primal on Adult Swim told a deeply emotional story about survival and loss with virtually no dialogue at all. These shows proved that animation as a medium was capable of extraordinary things, and they made the broader audience take animated storytelling more seriously than ever before. Family Guy existed in a completely different category from these shows, and it would be unfair to judge a 22-minute animated sitcom against an hour-long animated drama. But the prestige animation wave affected the conversation around all animated content. When people thought about adult animation in 2024, they were thinking about shows that push the medium forward in terms of storytelling, visual ambition, and emotional depth. Family Guy, with its cutaway gags and flanderized characters and recycled plots, was not part of that conversation. It was not even in the same building as that conversation. South Park deserves special mention in this competitive analysis because the show that had criticised Family Guy so harshly in 2006 went on to prove its own point by evolving in exactly the ways it had said Family Guy should. South Park moved toward more serialized storytelling, tackling complex social and political issues with increasing nuance and ambition. Parker and Stone developed their characters in ways that allowed them to grow and change over time. The boys aged, their relationships shifted, and the show maintained its edge while also developing genuine emotional stakes. The comparison between South Park's evolution and Family Guy's stagnation essentially validates the Cartoon Wars critique retroactively. Parker and Stone said that Family Guy's humour was disconnected from character and story, and then they spent the next 2 decades demonstrating what humour that is connected to character and story looks like. Whether you agree with their criticism or not, they backed it up with their own work in a way that is hard to argue with. The TikTok and YouTube clip phenomenon adds another dimension to how the competition affected Family Guy's perception. In the social media era, the best moments from animated shows circulate as short clips. Family Guy clips go viral constantly. A funny cutaway gag gets pulled out of context, posted on TikTok, and gets 10 million views. People laugh, share it, and move on. In isolation, these clips are often genuinely funny. A perfectly constructed 15-second joke is a perfectly constructed 15-second joke, regardless of what show it comes from. But this clip culture actually reinforces the South Park criticism in a way that damages Family Guy's reputation. If the best way to experience Family Guy is as decontextualized 30-second clips, that proves that the jokes are disconnected from the story. You do not need context to understand a Family Guy cutaway, because the cutaway has no context. Compare that to trying to clip a joke from Archer or Bob's Burgers, where the humour often depends on understanding the characters and their relationships and what happened earlier in the episode. The fact that Family Guy translates so perfectly to the clip format is simultaneously its greatest viral marketing tool and the strongest evidence for the argument that its comedy is structurally shallow. Every step forward that these competing shows took made Family Guy's standing still look worse, and Family Guy was not just standing still, it was actively declining. The gap between Family Guy and its competitors was not just a matter of other shows getting better, it was a matter of other shows getting better while Family Guy got worse. The combination of internal decline and external competition created a perception problem that the show may never fully recover from, at least among viewers who pay attention to the broader landscape of adult animation. And that brings us to the final and most complicated piece of this puzzle. Because the hatred of Family Guy is not really about the cutaway gags, or the flanderization, or the competition, or any single factor in isolation. The hatred of Family Guy is about something deeper, something psychological, something that has to do with the way human beings process the loss of something they once loved. If you have ever loved a band that sold out, or followed a sports team that traded away your favourite player, or watched a restaurant you grew up eating at get bought by a chain and lose everything that made it special, then you already understand why people hate Family Guy. It is the same feeling. It is not really about the thing itself. It is about the gap between what it was and what it became. The hatred is proportional to the love that came before it. Think about who hates Family Guy the most. It is not people who never watched the show. People who never cared about Family Guy do not waste their time writing essays about why it is terrible. The people who hate it the most are the people who loved it the most. They are the ones who stayed up late watching reruns on Adult Swim in 2003. They are the ones who bought those DVD box sets that brought the show back from cancellation. They are the ones who could quote entire episodes from memory, who knew every chicken fight beat by beat, who watched Road to the Multiverse and thought it was one of the best things they had ever seen on television. Those people feel betrayed, and betrayal is a much more powerful emotion than indifference. When something you never cared about gets worse, you shrug and move on. When something you loved deeply gets worse, it hurts, it feels personal, it feels like someone took something that belonged to you and broke it. The psychology of this is actually well documented. There is a concept in social psychology about the intensity of negative reactions being linked to the strength of prior positive attachments. The stronger your emotional connection to something, the more intense your reaction when that connection is violated. This is why breakups hurt more than rejections from strangers. This is why being let down by a close friend hurts more than being let down by an acquaintance. And this is why being disappointed by Family Guy hurts more for long-time fans than it does for casual viewers. The fans who hate Family Guy are not just criticising a television show, they are grieving a relationship. They had a connection with this show that was real and meaningful. It made them laugh during difficult times. It gave them something to share with friends. It was part of their identity during their formative years. A lot of the people who are most vocal about hating Family Guy discovered the show as teenagers, during that period of life when your tastes feel like extensions of your personality. Loving Family Guy was not just something they did, it was part of who they were. When the show changed, it felt like part of their identity was being erased. The thing that they had loved and defended and evangelized was turning into something they could no longer defend. And instead of quietly walking away, which would feel like admitting they had been wrong or to love it in the first place, they channeled that disappointment into vocal criticism. Hating Family Guy became a way of preserving their love for what Family Guy used to be. By articulating exactly what went wrong, they were simultaneously saying, "This show was once good, and I was right to love it." This dynamic creates an interesting tension in online discourse. The people who hate Family Guy the loudest are also the people who know the most about it. They can cite specific episodes, quote specific scenes, identify exact moments where the quality shifted. Their criticism is informed by deep, genuine knowledge of the show because they spent years absorbing every detail of it. This makes their arguments extremely compelling. When someone who has watched every episode of a show explains in detail why the show has declined, that carries a lot more weight than a random person saying, "This show sucks." But there is a flip side to this that deserves acknowledgement. The Family Guy was never good revisionism that has emerged in recent years is, to put it bluntly, not supported by the evidence. The numbers do not lie. Seasons 2 through 5 averaged between 7.5 and 7.6 on IMDb's per-season aggregate ratings. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 holds a 9.1 out of 10, which is exceptional for any television episode in any genre. The show sold 2.2 million DVD copies when it was cancelled, not because the DVDs were cheap or because there was nothing else to watch, but because people genuinely loved the content enough to spend money on owning it permanently. The first television revival driven by DVD sales is not something that happens to a bad show. It happens to a show that inspired genuine devotion. When people now claim that Family Guy was always terrible, they are engaging in a form of retroactive judgment that erases the real, documented experience of millions of viewers. Early Family Guy was good. Not just good in the context of its time, but good by any reasonable standard of animated comedy. It was inventive, energetic, surprising, and frequently hilarious. Pretending otherwise might feel satisfying if you're trying to win an argument online, but it does not align with the historical record. The internet pile-on effect has amplified and distorted the criticism in ways that are worth examining. Somewhere along the way, hating Family Guy became a cultural signifier. If you said you liked Family Guy in certain online spaces, you were marking yourself as someone with unsophisticated taste. If you said you hated Family Guy, you were signalling that you understood comedy on a deeper level. This turned criticism of the show into a performance, something people did to demonstrate their own discernment rather than to express a genuine opinion about a television program. This performative element explains why the criticism of Family Guy often feels disproportionate to the actual offences of the show. Is Family Guy a flawed show that has declined significantly from its peak? Absolutely. Is it the worst thing that has ever happened to animated comedy? A blight on the medium that should be expunged from existence? Obviously not. But the second framing gets more engagement online than the first one, so that is the framing that dominates the discourse. Nuanced opinions do not go viral. Extreme ones do. And the extreme position on Family Guy has become that the show is irredeemably terrible, which is an overcorrection that serves the critic's persona more than it serves the truth. There is also a generational dimension to all of this. Family Guy premiered in 1999. Its golden age ran through the mid-2000s. The people who experienced that golden age as teenagers or young adults are now in their 30s and 40s. They have changed. Their sense of humour has evolved. Their tolerance for shock value has decreased. Their expectations for storytelling and character development have increased. When they watch modern Family Guy and find it wanting, some of that disappointment is genuinely about the show getting worse. But some of it is about them getting older. The show that made you laugh uncontrollably at 16 might not hit the same way at 36, even if the show itself had not changed at all. This is not an excuse for the show's genuine creative problems. The Flanderization is real. The declining writing quality is real. The over-reliance on shock value and filler is real. But the intensity of the emotional reaction to those problems is magnified by the fact that the audience has outgrown the show in ways they did not anticipate when they were younger. Growing up and finding that your old favourites do not hold up anymore is a universal human experience. And it is always a little bit sad, even when it is not the show's fault. The 25th anniversary paradox hangs over everything. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. It has been on the air with interruptions for over a quarter of a century. No show in the history of television has maintained peak quality for 25 years. Not one. The Simpsons could not do it. Saturday Night Live could not do it. Doctor Who could not do it. Every long-running show cycles through golden ages and dark periods. The expectation that Family Guy should be an exception to this universal rule is unreasonable, even if the disappointment of watching the decline is completely understandable. But let's set the psychology aside for a moment and talk about what Family Guy actually accomplished. Because in the rush to criticize the show's decline, people often forget just how significant its contributions to television and popular culture really were. Family Guy popularized the cutaway gag format in animated television. Before Family Guy, the dominant model for animated sitcoms was the Simpsons model, which was essentially a traditional sitcom structure rendered in animation. You had a setup, a conflict, rising action, a resolution, and jokes that were woven into the fabric of the story. Family Guy shattered that model. It introduced this stream of consciousness style, where the narrative could be interrupted at any moment by an unrelated joke, a flashback to something that never happened, a fantasy sequence, a musical number, a reference to something that had nothing to do with the plot. That was genuinely revolutionary when it first appeared. You can argue about whether it was good or bad for comedy, and plenty of people do, but you cannot argue that it was not influential. The cutaway format has been imitated, parodied, and referenced by countless shows and creators since Family Guy introduced it. The show also played a significant role in launching the adult animation boom of the 2000s. Family Guy proved that there was a massive audience for animated comedy aimed at adults, an audience that extended far beyond the one that The Simpsons had cultivated. American Dad, The Cleveland Show, Archer, Bob's Burgers, Big Mouth, BoJack Horseman, and dozens of other shows benefited from a market that Family Guy helped expand. Not all of those shows were directly influenced by Family Guy's style, but they all existed in a landscape that Family Guy helped create by demonstrating the commercial viability of adult animated content. The DVD revival story is arguably Family Guy's most important contribution to the television industry, and it has nothing to do with comedy. When Family Guy came back from cancellation in 2005, driven primarily by DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings, it changed the way networks and studios thought about the value of their cancelled properties. Before Family Guy, a cancelled show was a cancelled show. The decision was made, the sets were struck, the cast moved on, and that was the end of it. Family Guy proved that a cancelled show could maintain and even grow its audience through home media and reruns, and that audience could become large enough to justify a revival. This model has been cited repeatedly in industry analysis as a paradigm shift. You can draw a direct line from Family Guy's DVD-driven comeback to the current era of revivals and reboots on streaming platforms, where networks routinely bring back cancelled shows because they know there is an existing audience waiting for them. Family Guy also changed the economics of voice acting in animation. When the core voice actors renegotiated their salaries to the $175,000 to $225,000 per episode range, it set a new benchmark for what animated voice performers could command. Before those negotiations, voice actors on animated shows were generally paid significantly less than their live-action counterparts. Family Guy, along with The Simpsons, helped establish that voicing a beloved animated character was worth serious money. That shift benefited voice actors across the entire industry. And then there is Seth MacFarlane himself. Whatever you think about Family Guy's quality, MacFarlane's career trajectory is genuinely remarkable. He went from a student at the Rhode Island School of Design to one of the most powerful creators in Hollywood. He built a production empire that spans multiple television shows, feature films, and a major deal with NBC Universal. He is a rare example of someone who succeeded in animation, live action, film, television, hosting, and music. He has won Emmy Awards, hosted the Academy Awards, starred in a science fiction series, directed a movie that grossed over $500 million, and still finds time to record voices for multiple animated shows every week. Family Guy was the launchpad for all of that, and its success enabled MacFarlane to pursue a range of creative ambitions that few people in entertainment ever get to explore. None of this erases the legitimate criticisms of the show's later seasons, but it provides context that the Family Guy was always trash crowd tends to ignore. The show was important, it mattered, it changed things. The fact that it declined does not retroactively negate its accomplishments, any more than a legendary athlete's late career struggles negate their championship years. Now let me address something that nobody in the Family Guy discourse seems to want to talk about honestly: the question of whether the show can recover. The truth is, probably not. Not in the sense of returning to its season 4 through 8 glory, at least. The conditions that produced that golden age no longer exist. MacFarlane is not going to abandon his other projects and return to writing Family Guy full-time. The cultural landscape is not going to revert to a time when shock humour carried the same currency it did in 2005. The characters have been so thoroughly Flanderized that reversing the damage would essentially require rebooting the show from scratch. And even then, audiences would approach the rebooted versions with justified skepticism. But there is a different kind of recovery that is more realistic, and in some ways, it is already happening. Some fans and critics have noted that certain later seasons, particularly around seasons 15, 16, and into the early 20s, showed signs of modest improvement. The show has made efforts to dial back the worst excesses of the Meg abuse. Peter has had episodes where he shows genuine affection for his family in ways that feel like callbacks to the earlier seasons. Stewie and Brian's dynamic, which has always been the show's strongest element, still produces genuinely enjoyable episodes. The animation quality has improved consistently over the years, with the HD transition in Season 9 and subsequent upgrades making the show visually slicker than it has ever been. These improvements are not enough to satisfy people who want the show to return to its peak, and they are probably right to hold that standard. But they suggest that the creative team is aware of the criticisms and is making at least some effort to address them. Whether those efforts are sufficient is a matter of individual judgment. The more likely future for Family Guy is not a dramatic quality recovery, but a gradual transition into a different kind of cultural object. The show is already well on its way to becoming what The Simpsons became years ago, a permanent institution of American television that exists less as a show people actively watch and more as a show that simply is. It is always there. It is always on. You can find it on half a dozen platforms at any hour of the day. New episodes appear with the regularity of the tides, and nobody gets particularly excited or particularly upset about them because the show has moved beyond the sphere of active cultural conversation and into the realm of ambient entertainment. There is something almost peaceful about that trajectory, even if it is not the ending that fans of the Golden Age would have chosen. Family Guy does not need to be great anymore. It does not even need to be good. It needs to exist, and it will continue to exist because the economics of streaming make it virtually impossible to cancel a show that generates as much passive viewership as Family Guy does. The show has achieved a kind of immortality, not through excellence, but through ubiquity. And maybe that is okay. Maybe not everything needs to maintain its peak forever. Maybe it is enough for a show to burn bright for a few years, accomplish something significant, and then settle into a comfortable old age where it keeps the lights on without demanding much from anyone. The Golden Age episodes are not going anywhere. You can still watch Road to the Multiverse or the first chicken fight or the early Stewie and Brian road trips whenever you want. Those episodes are preserved in amber on streaming platforms and DVD box sets, exactly as good as they always were, completely unaffected by whatever the show is doing in its current season. The real question is not whether Family Guy is still good. The real question is whether it matters that it is not. And the answer depends entirely on what you want from a television show. If you want art that challenges you and evolves and pushes the medium forward, Family Guy has not been that show for a long time, and there are plenty of other animated series that will give you what you're looking for. If you want something familiar and reliable that you can put on while you're doing other things, Family Guy is actually better at that job than almost any other show on television. The hatred of Family Guy is real, and it is grounded in legitimate grievances about declining quality, ruined characters, lazy writing, and unfulfilled potential. But the hatred is also amplified by nostalgia, by internet culture, by performative criticism, and by the natural human tendency to feel betrayed when something we loved stops being lovable. Family Guy is not as bad as its harshest critics claim, and it is not as good as its most devoted fans insist. It is a show that was once genuinely special, that lost its way over a long period of time, and that now exists in this strange liminal space between cultural relevance and cultural furniture. There is one more thing I want to leave you with, and it is the detail that I keep coming back to every time I think about this topic. In 2003, Family Guy was dead, cancelled, done, and the fans refused to let it die. They bought those record-breaking DVDs. They flooded Adult Swim with ratings. They created an audience so large and so enthusiastic that Fox had no choice but to bring the show back. That had never happened before in the history of television, and that is the real tragedy of the Family Guy story. The show that fans loved enough to resurrect eventually became the show that those same fans grew to resent. The resurrection itself, this unprecedented act of audience devotion, is what enabled the later seasons that disappointed so many people. If the DVDs had not sold, if the Adult Swim ratings had not been there, Family Guy would have ended after 3 seasons. It would be remembered as a cult classic that was gone too soon. It would be the subject of what-if conversations and nostalgia posts. Instead, it came back, and the extra 20+ years of content gave it enough rope to hang itself in the court of public opinion. The fans who brought Family Guy back from the dead are the same fans who now wish it had stayed dead. Or at least, they wish it had stayed the show they remembered. They wanted their show back, and they got it. But then the show changed, and the thing they had fought so hard to save became something they could no longer recognise. People do not write thousands of words about shows they never cared about. People do not make hour-long video essays dissecting the decline of a programme that meant nothing to them. The anger, the frustration, the disappointment, all of it is a byproduct of love. Every person who hates Family Guy today loved Family Guy once. And somewhere inside them, past the cynicism and the criticism and the memes about manatees pushing idea balls, they still love it. They love the version that existed in their memory, the version that made them laugh so hard they bought the DVDs, the version that was good enough to come back from the dead. Family Guy's hated because it was loved first. And that might be the most Family Guy thing about the whole situation. A show famous for its dark irony ended up living the darkest irony of all. The love of its fans is what saved it, and the show that was saved could never live up to the love that saved it. That is the story of why Family Guy became hated. It is a story about a brilliant kid from Connecticut who created something special, a network that did not appreciate it, fans who fought to bring it back, a creator who got pulled in too many directions, characters who lost their souls, a culture that changed around a show that did not change with it, competitors who evolved while it stood still, and an audience that grew up faster than the show did. And through all of it, through the cancellations and the comebacks and the controversies and the criticism, the show kept going. It is still going right now. New episodes are being produced for Fox. Specials are being made for Hulu. Reruns are playing on half a dozen networks. Clips are going viral on TikTok and YouTube. Millions of people are streaming it at this very moment, right now, as you listen to this. Family Guy remains one of the most watched programs in the entire streaming era. Hundreds of millions of viewing hours generated by a show that the internet has declared irredeemable. If that is not the setup for a Family Guy cutaway gag, I do not know what is. So maybe the final lesson here is simpler than all the analysis and history and psychology would suggest. Maybe the real lesson is that television is complicated, and audiences are complicated, and the relationship between a show and the people who watch it is more nuanced than any Reddit thread or YouTube comment section can capture. Maybe a show can be genuinely great and genuinely terrible at different points in its life, and both of those things can be true simultaneously without cancelling each other out. Maybe you can hate something and still leave it on in the background while you fall asleep, and that is not a contradiction. That is just what it means to have a long and messy relationship with a piece of culture that has been part of your life for 25 years. Anyway, that is the story. If you made it this far, you are either really interested in animation history or you're trying to fall asleep. And honestly, either way, I am glad you're here. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. We do this kind of deep dive all the time. And if you are still awake, maybe put on an episode of Family Guy. Seasons 4 through 8, trust me, those episodes still hold up. They are still funny. They are still worth your time. But maybe skip the later seasons. You will sleep better. Actually, before we wrap up completely, I want to go deeper on something I touched on earlier, but did not fully explore. The way Family Guy exists on the internet, because the show's relationship with internet culture is honestly one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole story. Family Guy might be the most memed animated show in existence, and I am including SpongeBob in that comparison. Peter Griffin falling and holding his knee, Stewie's victory is mine pose, the oh no moments, Brian's smug face, Quagmire saying, giggity. These images and clips have been repurposed millions of times across every social media platform. Family Guy reaction images show up in group chats, comment sections, and meme compilations completely divorced from their original context. This creates a paradox within a paradox. Family Guy is simultaneously hated as a television show and beloved as source material for internet content. The same people who would never sit down and watch a full episode of modern Family Guy will happily share a Family Guy clip or meme without any sense of contradiction. The show's cultural presence has become larger than the show itself. Family Guy exists in the public consciousness not as 400+ episodes of animated television, but as a library of infinitely recyclable comedy fragments. And this feeds directly back into the criticism because it proves the South Park point in a way that even Trey Parker and Matt Stone probably did not anticipate. If the best version of Family Guy is a 15-second clip stripped of all context, then the show's humour really is disconnected from its narrative. The cutaway gag format that critics have mocked for 2 decades turns out to be perfectly designed for the short-form content economy of the 2020s. Every cutaway is a potential TikTok. Every random joke is a potential meme. The format that made Family Guy feel lazy in the context of traditional television storytelling makes it feel efficient in the context of social media. This is why Family Guy will probably never truly die, regardless of how much the quality declines. The show has become a content generator in the purest sense. It does not need to produce great episodes, or even good episodes. It just needs to produce moments, individual jokes and visual gags and quotable lines that can be extracted and shared independently. As long as the show keeps creating those moments, it will maintain its presence in internet culture. And that presence translates directly into streaming numbers, because people who encounter the clips eventually decide to watch the show, even if they are just watching it in the background. The relationship between Family Guy and its internet audience also explains why the show's demographic has shifted over time. The original Family Guy audience was made up of people who watched the show on Fox during prime time or caught reruns on Adult Swim. They were active viewers who chose to watch Family Guy over other options. The current audience includes a massive contingent of people who discovered the show through clips, memes, and compilations on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. These viewers did not choose Family Guy in the way the original audience did. They were exposed to it algorithmically, one clip at a time, until the show became familiar enough that streaming a full episode felt natural. This algorithmic audience has different expectations and different standards than the original audience. They are not comparing Season 22 to Season 4 because they did not experience Season 4 in real time. They are not disappointed by flanderized characters because they never knew the original versions. They are not frustrated by recycled plots because they have not seen enough episodes to recognize the repetition. For them, Family Guy is just a funny show with short episodes that they can watch on their phone. It is content, not art. And judged purely as content, modern Family Guy is perfectly adequate. This generational divide in the audience creates a strange dynamic where 2 groups of people are essentially watching different shows. The legacy audience sees A Fallen Giant, a show that squandered its potential and betrayed its original promise. The newer audience sees a solid library of comedy content that is easy to consume and reasonably entertaining. Neither group is wrong. They are just evaluating the show against completely different baselines, and the gap between those baselines is what generates most of the heat in the online discourse. I also want to talk about something that gets overlooked in discussions about Family Guy's decline, which is the sheer physical difficulty of producing over 400 episodes of anything. Writing comedy is hard. Writing animated comedy is harder because every joke needs to be visualized, storyboarded, animated, voiced and timed with a precision that live-action comedy does not require. Doing that 20 to 22 times per season, every season, for over 2 decades, is a Herculean task that grinds down even the most talented creative teams. The Family Guy writing staff has turned over multiple times since the show's inception. Writers who were there during the golden age have moved on to other projects, or retired from the industry entirely. New writers have come in with different sensibilities, different comedic influences, and different ideas about what the show should be. The show is not being written by the same people who made it great, and expecting a new group of writers to perfectly replicate the voice and sensibility of their predecessors is unrealistic, even with detailed style guides and institutional knowledge. This is not an excuse for bad writing. It is an explanation for why maintaining quality over such a long period is essentially impossible. Even shows with remarkably stable creative teams experience quality fluctuations over time. When you add in the constant turnover of writers, the reduced involvement of the creator, the pressure to produce content at a consistent pace, and the creative exhaustion that inevitably comes from working on the same property for decades, the decline becomes not just understandable, but almost inevitable. The writers who work on Family Guy today are not incompetent. Many of them are talented comedians and writers who could probably produce excellent work under different circumstances, but they are working within a system that incentivizes the path of least resistance. The show has a format that works. The network is not asking for innovation. The streaming numbers are strong regardless of quality. In that environment, the rational thing to do is keep producing episodes that meet the minimum acceptable standard rather than taking creative risks that might backfire. It is a creativity trap, and it is one that almost every long-running show eventually falls into. The comparison to fast food is apt, even if it is a bit unkind. Early Family Guy was a handcrafted meal prepared by a passionate chef. Modern Family Guy is the same restaurant after it got franchised. The menu looks similar. The name is the same. Some of the ingredients are still there. But the thing that made it special, the personal touch, the creative ambition, the willingness to try something new and risk failure, that has been replaced by standardized processes and consistent, mediocre output. It feeds people, and people keep coming back, but nobody is going to call it a great meal. The thing that gives me the most complicated feelings about Family Guy's trajectory is the waste of potential. This is a show with an incredibly talented voice cast. Seth MacFarlane is one of the most gifted voice performers in animation history. Alex Borstein brings real depth and versatility to every character she plays. Seth Green, Mila Kunis, Mike Henry, and the extended cast are all genuinely skilled performers who can elevate mediocre material through sheer talent. The show's animation team produces work that is technically excellent, especially in recent seasons where the HD transition and digital workflow have allowed for cleaner, more dynamic visuals than the show has ever had. All of that talent and all of those resources are being deployed in service of scripts that frequently do not deserve them. It is like having a Formula One engine in a car with flat tyres. The potential is obviously there. The raw materials are excellent, but the thing that brings it all together, the writing, is not operating at the level of everything else. And that gap between the quality of the production and the quality of the scripts is part of what makes modern Family Guy so frustrating to watch for people who understand what the show is capable of. I think about what Family Guy could be if it had the writing quality of American Dad, the character warmth of Bob's Burgers, the satirical precision of early South Park, and the creative ambition of its own first 5 seasons. That hypothetical version of Family Guy would be extraordinary. It would be the best animated comedy on television by a wide margin. All of the pieces are there. The voice cast, the animation team, the brand recognition, the audience, the institutional infrastructure. The only thing missing is the one thing that matters most, the writing. And that is probably the saddest part of this whole story. Family Guy is not hated because it was destined to fail. It is hated because it was destined to succeed and then chose not to. The show had everything it needed to remain great, and somewhere along the way, whether through creative exhaustion or commercial complacency or the slow withdrawal of its creators' active involvement, it stopped reaching for greatness and settled for adequacy. The audience, which had once been willing to campaign for the show's resurrection, eventually got tired of watching it underperform its own potential. So here we are. Family Guy is still on the air. New episodes are being produced. Millions of people are still watching. The show generates massive streaming revenue and continues to be one of the most recognized brands in all of animation. And a significant portion of its audience, including many of its most passionate former fans, actively hate it. It is a strange place for a show to be, but then again, Family Guy has always been a strange show. Born from a student film at an art school, cancelled after 3 seasons, revived by DVD sales, criticised by South Park, embraced by the internet, and hated by the people who once loved it the most. The story of Family Guy is the story of American television itself, messy and contradictory, and endlessly complicated, and somehow still playing in the background, no matter how many times you think it is over. That is the full story. Thanks for listening. Sleep well. Actually, one more thing. I want to go back to something that happened at the very beginning of this story, because I think it ties everything together in a way that is almost poetic. When Seth MacFarlane created The Life of Larry as a student film at the Rhode Island School of Design, the whole thing was basically a joke. It was a college kid fooling around with animation, making his friends laugh with a dumb cartoon about a fat guy and his sarcastic dog. There was no business plan. There was no market research. There was no focus group telling him what kind of humour tested well with the 18 to 34 demographic. It was just a young artist making something because he thought it was funny. And that purity, that total absence of commercial calculation, is what made early Family Guy feel so alive. When the show premiered in 1999, it still had that student film energy. The jokes were personal. The references were specific. The humour came from a place of genuine creative joy rather than institutional obligation. MacFarlane was a young man who could not believe he'd been given a television show, and that disbelief translated into a manic creative energy that infected every frame of the early episodes. The transition from that raw creative energy to the corporate content production machine that Family Guy eventually became is not unique to this show. It happens to every successful creative enterprise. The indie band gets signed to a major label and their sound changes. The small restaurant gets popular and opens more locations and the food gets worse. The startup gets acquired by a bigger company and the culture shifts. Success breeds scale and scale breeds standardization. And standardization kills the thing that made the original product special in the first place. Family Guy's golden age was the period when the show still felt like it was being made by people who were having fun. The decline corresponds to the period when it started feeling like it was being made by people who were fulfilling a contract. You can feel the difference when you watch the episodes back to back. The early seasons crackle with energy and surprise. The later seasons hum with competence and routine. Both are professionally produced, animated television. But one was made with love, and the other was made with obligation. An audience that still, and when the show came back, it had the energy of something that had survived extinction and was determined to prove the doubters wrong. That energy lasted for a few seasons. Then the show got comfortable again. Then the stakes went away. Then the hunger disappeared. And slowly, one episode at a time, one Flanderized character at a time, one recycled plot at a time, Family Guy became the thing that comfortable, low stakes, commercially secure creative enterprises always become. Safe and predictable and just adequate enough to keep the lights on. Not bad enough to cancel. Not good enough to love. And that is a kind of death that no DVD sales campaign can reverse. Because the show is still alive in the technical sense, New episodes exist. The characters talk and move and make jokes. But the thing that made people fall in love with Family Guy in the first place, that wild, unpredictable, slightly dangerous energy of a young creator who could not believe his luck, that died a long time ago. And what remains is a memorial to it. A very expensive, very professional, very well-produced memorial that airs every Sunday night on Fox and streams 24 hours a day on Hulu, and will probably continue to do so for as long as any of us are alive. Family Guy is not hated because it is a bad show. Family Guy is hated because it is a ghost of a great show, and seeing a ghost of something you loved is always worse than never having loved it at all. That is the real reason why Family Guy has suddenly become hated. It is not sudden at all. It has been happening for 15 years, one disappointment at a time, building slowly like water wearing away stone until the surface is unrecognizable. The show did not fall off a cliff. It walked downhill so gradually that nobody noticed until they looked back and saw how far they had come from the top. Now it is late, and if you're still listening, you should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow the world will still be complicated and confusing and full of shows that are not as good as they used to be, but tonight at least you know the full story of one of them. Good night. And hey, if you are not asleep yet, do me a favour, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me what you think about Family Guy. Do you still watch it? Do you miss the old seasons? Do you think it can ever recover? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your take on this one. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Peace.